Very pleased to introduce you James Rodgers, who's come down from London today to talk to you specifically. He was for a very long time a correspondent for BBC in Moscow. He's also worked in Gaza and other places in the Middle East. He is an author of 3 books now, I think it is. So he's come to talk to you today about international conflict reporting.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to come down and talk today. As Sally said, I now teach and I write books, but I was a journalist for 20 years, 5 of them for Reuters Television and 15 for the BBC. Most of those I worked in international news. I did postings in Moscow, Brussels and Gaza. So while I do work as a journalism lecturer, now I'm going to talk to you mostly today about my experiences as a journalist, and I'll be delighted to take your questions at the end. And I say I'm going to talk to you as a journalist rather than as an academic, but I do still try very much to keep up my journalism as a way of keeping in touch with my teaching too. So one of the things that I want to talk to you about particularly is about the way that the world has changed. I'm going to start really looking in some ways over the last quarter of a century almost, but I think if we look at the way the world has changed, we can also see some way that journalism has changed too. Now, does anybody know what that is? Pravda. It is Pravda, yes. It is the one of the newspapers of the, as it says, from the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Now, I think most people in the room probably weren't even born before the Soviet Union met its demise, but does everybody know pretty much what it was? This is a newspaper from the year that I first went on my first foreign assignment. So I caught the very end of the Soviet Union. But if we look at one of the reasons I wanted to show you this slide was to look at the way in which things have changed. For a lot of people then in the Soviet Union, this was where the news came from. Yes, there were broadcast media, but a lot of people were getting news from the newspapers. And this, no websites, nothing else, and this was something that you would need to sort of follow every single day, and this was something very readily recognisable then. And of course, since one of the things that really changed, journalism in many ways has changed almost beyond recognition in terms of some journalistic practices. In other ways, it has changed, I would suggest, very little at all. But there are 2 constant things that I want to keep referring to in today's talk, really. And those 2 constant things which continue to shape the way in which journalism evolves, and those are politics and technology. And obviously when we look at this, we can see a newspaper with no colour in it, and technology of course has changed very dramatically since then, and the politics have too. And as journalists, we always have to be interested in change. Change of which the consequences aren't always obvious. And I'd like to just to make that point more broadly, I'd like to read you a very short extract from an interview which the late historian Eric Hobsbawm gave in 2011, where he was asked then about the consequences of the Arab uprisings, which were then very sweeping across the Middle East. And he said, and he compared it to a series of revolutions which happened in Europe in the middle of the 19th century, in 1848. And he said of those, 2 years after 1848, it looked as if it had all failed. In the long run, it hadn't failed. A good deal of liberal advances had been made. So it was an immediate failure, but a longer-term partial success, though no longer in the form of a revolution. And I think in covering international events, in covering change, this is one of the very hardest things which journalists have to do, because we have to try to understand in the moment what the consequences are likely to be in 5 or 10 years' time. If I go back to my example of the Soviet Union then, in the 1990s, for the end of the Cold War, which had dominated the 20th century, there was a moment when the West and the East were becoming friends. There were suspicious friends to begin with, perhaps. But I think most people who experienced that moment then did not foresee, or certainly hoped they wouldn't foresee, this time now when we regularly see in the media discussions of a new Cold War. Now, we can talk later about whether that's an accurate description or not, but certainly relations between Russia and the West were not what people hoped they would be when the Soviet Union ended almost 25 years ago. So I say this because it's one of the understanding the consequences of change and the nature of change are one of the big challenges which we face. But even the end of the Soviet Union was not as rosy as it seemed. And this is a photograph from a rather grainy old photograph from Moscow in 1993. And this was one of the things I wanted to make the point about reporting on conflict and reporting revolution is it doesn't just happen in the moment. If you pick up a history of the Russian Revolution in 1917, the centenary of which we're approaching, you will see that very invariably they'll start in 1905 and end in the 1920s, because it takes that long for the process to go through. Very hard for us to reflect as journalists. How do we do that when we're supposed to be thinking about the day? But just 2 years after the end of the Soviet Union, there was a standoff between, broadly speaking, between conservative political forces who were opposed to the way that society in Moscow was changing and those who were in favour of it, taking Russia in a more Western direction. But the reason why I've chosen this photograph in particular is because I think it says something about the kind of conflicts which we as journalists have to cover today. If you look at where that is, if you see, if it were a wider shot, it's right on the banks of, this is the beginning of a bridge which goes across the Moscow River, which goes through the Russian capital, as many rivers do in big cities. But the point that I wanted to make about this is it's right in the middle of a city. And we see all these people standing here. These are actually tanks which are firing tear gas. They're firing on a target across the river. But it was a nice autumn day. You can probably see from the colours. It was about this time of year. It was in October, actually. People had come out to have a look. People were sort of in their lunch break were coming out to get involved in the war. So the reason why I wanted to show this was because in our time, wars are not, as we know, they're no longer fought on battlefields at arranged times, and increasingly, if we look at Syria, they are fought in urban landscapes among civilian populations. And this is the nature, really, of conflict in our time. So that was one sort of consequence, if you like, at the end of that was quite hard to foresee. And one thing I really want to stress about this too is the suddenness with which this happened. These tensions have been building, but a couple of days before this there had been the celebration of the anniversary of the founding of Moscow. It was sort of like a town day, a festival they had. And people had gone out to celebrate in the streets, but within that was a sort of political element. There was a minor confrontation with the police, and then people started picking up rocks and throwing them at the police, and then by the evening of that day, Moscow is built on a series of circles. There's an inner ring road, which is right in the city centre. By the evening of that day, that road was closed with burning barricades. So it all happened very, very quickly. And as a journalist, you had to be very, very aware of what was going on around you. There was a real important safety point there. Because what seemed to be just a nice sort of celebration of the anniversary of the city suddenly turned into a confrontation, suddenly turned into a riot, and within a few days was armed conflict, right, with tanks and with artillery right in the centre of the city. So there's a very important point when you're ever out on somewhere where there is tension, just to be really aware of what's going on around you, because it can change very, very quickly in an apparently sort of peaceful city centre. In some ways, this incident seems, I think, to have brought violence into Russian politics, because at the end of the following year, Russia launched a military campaign in Chechnya, which was a region in the southern edge of the country, in the north of the Caucasus Mountains. That again began as a sort of separatist insurgency, and within a few months, the city centre looked like this. Scenes which really hadn't been seen in Europe then since the Second World War. Of course, there had been war in Yugoslavia, but not quite on the same scale because of the aerial bombardments involved. And so this was, again, this was an interesting experience, because I think it also helped to define the way that conflict has been reported, define for me the way that conflict has been reported in this century. Again, you can see that building, of which you can see the skeleton behind, that was actually the head of the local administration. So this is right in the city centre, and 6 months previously or so, this would have been, all these buildings would have been complete. But what was interesting about that conflict was there was absolutely no restriction placed upon journalists at all, apart from those safety considerations which I mentioned. Wherever you felt bold enough to go, you could, with the result that you had that rarest thing, which was open actually to few other people, apart from other journalists. In covering this conflict, journalists were actually able to talk to both sides in the course of the day. You could talk to Russian soldiers in the morning, the Russian soldiers who were attacking the rebel positions in the capital, then having crossed their lines, as I say, if you felt bold enough, but you needed to in some ways to go to get the story, you could then talk to some of the Chechen rebel fighters in the afternoon. And I think possibly on the basis of the free access that followed, you can imagine seeing the sort of area in which that's taking place, that there were colossal civilian casualties in this war. No one has ever accurately estimated it, but I've read reasonably reliable estimates of there being as many as 100,000 people killed in the course of this war. And possibly upon the basis of that, I think there were two lessons which were learned. One which was learned by the Russian government, because subsequently they made it much harder for Western reporters to go there, because they clearly received a lot of unfavourable coverage. It wasn't the sort of coverage which they wanted at all. So they tried to control very strictly the reporting which was done when the Second Chechen War began some 2 or 3 years later. So they learnt a very important lesson in the way that they were going to manage the media. But I think too, and I think that gave rise to what I called, rather than talking about embedded reporting, I prefer to talk about open and controlled reporting. So in some conflicts, like the way I described at the beginning of that, where you could really go wherever you felt that it was safe to go, which it wasn't safe to go to quite a lot of places, but it was really left up to you how to set your agenda. Nobody was trying to influence you. But subsequently, then much more stricter controls were placed upon journalists reporting this conflict. And the other thing, which I think is very important to take away from this conflict. I mean, many people in the room may have vaguely heard of the area. They won't necessarily remember, of course, because it was quite a long time ago, the loss of life which was involved. But for me, as a young journalist then, it taught me a rather sad lesson, I have to say, which was this. However much the reporting conveys the suffering of a civilian population, unless there is some kind of political or diplomatic will to do something about it, nothing will result. Now, many of us, and I was no exception, became a journalist because you wanted to try to put right bad things in the world. But if we look at Syria too, I think this is an example that proves my point in the last few years, where the casualties have dwarfed even what was going on there. In cases, for example, if we think perhaps of Kosovo or of Sierra Leone, when there was a clear and quite easy military option to be pursued, then the reporting could help to nudge governments towards that. But where there was no such easy or short-term or obvious military option, and there was no political will, in this case, because as I mentioned, the Cold War had ended, Russia and the West had their best relationship pretty much for the whole of the 20th century, there was no desire to try to antagonise Russia by getting involved in this. So unfortunately the civilians, however good the reporting was, were just left to their fate. Now obviously for any Western and particularly British journalist of my generation, September the 11th was a big milestone in our professional lives. I was based in Brussels then, and I was actually, and this is a sort of curious way that stories come round again, on September the 11th I was in Calais reporting on migrants trying to cross the Channel, which was still very much happening in 2001, although probably not quite on the scale that we've seen it happening in the last few months. So once the attacks happened, obviously everything was off that day, as you can probably imagine. Every single story that was planned was chucked in the bin, and we waited. I was waiting to try to get a flight from Brussels to the United States, because some of you may know, and some of you may indeed remember, the whole of the United States airspace was closed after the attacks, as indeed were transatlantic flights. And so I was able, finally, after a couple of nights of going to Brussels airport and hoping to get on a plane and then having to go back to my flat afterwards and realise it wasn't going to happen that night. On the night of the 13th of September, 2 days after the attacks, I was able to fly to Montreal in Canada, and then we drove down from there, and I reached Manhattan just on the Friday evening, 3 days after the attack. And I think this was this photograph was taken in Iraq in 2004 during the American-British occupation of Iraq. But there's one really important lesson which I remember above all. I mean, obviously the impressions of seeing something like that, when you realise, as the cliche goes, you witness something that is going to change your world, and it has, obviously changed the world in which we live, and it continues to influence it today. But there was also one, I think, quite important ethical lesson I learned, if that's the right way of phrasing, but also an ethical dilemma of which I became acutely aware. As I said, I got there on the Friday afternoon, and on the Sunday I was preparing a sort of longer feature piece for broadcast on the Monday morning. But on the Sunday, it was only 5 days after the attack, and there were a lot of people still looking for their relatives, just in the area around. You couldn't approach, you couldn't get right down to the area where the rescue workers were working at that time. You could get quite close to it. And because this was a time when, yes, there was internet, but social media hadn't really happened, there was a lot of those people had photocopied signs of their relatives, and they put those, where they cut pieces of paper with phone numbers on, and they put those on the bottom of there. And the reason why I mention this in terms of ethics and dealing with people who find themselves caught up in traumatic or conflict situations was this, because there were a lot of people, as I say, who were absolutely convinced that they were going to find their relatives. This was 5 days afterwards. Now, clearly, it's possible that some of them did. People might have been dazed, or they might have been injured, or they might have been in hospital. But of course, looked at objectively, from me as an outsider, it seemed highly unlikely that any of them ever would. So it was quite difficult to know how to approach these people. Clearly, you can't say that. That would be so totally and crassly insensitive. But it's also a difficult one. What sort of responsibility do you have in putting that on the air afterwards, when you have people saying, I'm sure I'm going to find her, I'm sure I'm going to find him, when you know that that's very, very unlikely? And that question came back to me after that Malaysian Airlines MH370 disappeared. I remember there was a woman on the BBC, a woman, I think, an American woman, and she and her partner had lived in China, I think. Anyway, she gave quite a lengthy interview saying, I'm certain he's out there, and clearly now the chances of anyone being found alive from that flight are almost zero. But I don't have a necessary solution to that, but I mention it because I think it's a very important point to consider, not just when you're reporting on armed conflict, but anything, any sort of natural disaster which would happen, any fire in the centre of town when people are missing. It's a real important thing that we need to consider as journalists. How do we treat these people as contributors? We need to take their feelings into account. Some people will refuse to talk to you in situations like that, say, no, I've got nothing to say to you. Some people will find it beneficial because they sometimes, particularly people who've been cut off in areas, like I found in Chechnya, when people have been cut off and no one from outside had bothered to talk to them for months. Sometimes they want to talk to you. But I think it's something, it's a question which we as journalists need to bear in mind and to consider when we use our judgment as to how we use our material in cases like that. And I went, and after that, I went twice to Iraq, which is where one of those photos are taken, and I'll talk about that in a little more detail in a moment. But my next move after being in Brussels was to go to cover the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And from 2002 to 2004, I was the only international correspondent based in the Gaza Strip, which was professionally very challenging, but it was also, as you can probably imagine, extremely rewarding. And this, I think, there is no other conflict in the world, probably, certainly one which receives the same attention that it does from the international Western media, which is scrutinised to the extent that it is. I think it is probably the hardest conflict to write a 200-word news story on, because you have to weigh every single word at such a great length, and even once you finish doing that, you're going to be accused of bias or of omission or deliberately favouring one side or the other. And I'll come on to some sort of general points at the end, but I think in this particular case, it is one of the greatest challenges when you have to write a 200-word news story or write a 40-second radio report, and you have also to reflect in that at least 100 years of history and up to 2,000 years of religion too. It's not easy to do, ladies and gentlemen, as you can probably imagine. But you will find, and I've just actually done quite a big research project on this and just published a book on this actually. I've interviewed a lot of correspondents and diplomats involved with the conflict. But you'll find that that's what your audiences will often expect you to do. And there were big challenges in this. There was occasional physical danger. There was getting a sensitive story right as well. Again, some of those lessons I learned talking to people after September the 11th came back to me when talking to people whose children had been killed, which was the kind of people you did have to interview there, doing that job, obviously. and trying to remain impartial. Now we can discuss whether that's an appropriate approach or not in terms of conflict like this, where, for example, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one side quite clearly militarily outguns the other massively. Is it right to try to remain? I don't, you know, you can't sort of. Is it right to sort of treat like with like? And I don't think that impartiality necessarily means that. But obviously I came from a BBC journalistic tradition, from an impartial one, so we had that requirement placed upon us, not, if you like, to take sides, not to say, to take one particular view or the other. But it's not always easy. And so I'd like to, if I may, I'm going to read you a page or so of a book that I published a couple of years ago, which I think sums up one of the opportunities and dilemmas that you get when you get opportunities in cases like this. And this is when I was invited to go out. I was invited by the Israeli army, who knew that I was the only Western correspondent living there, to go with some of their troops on an operation when they were going to come into the Gaza Strip. So, if I may, I'll just read you a page or so, which I think it sort of sums up some of the dilemmas that were involved in taking the decision and the experience of the night. On the evening of the 5th of March 2003, 2 weeks before the United States and its allies began their invasion of Iraq, I received a telephone call from the Israeli Army's Southern Command. They asked me if I wanted to go on an operation that night. My contact, whom I knew from a meeting he had previously arranged for me with a senior officer in the Southern Command, forbade me from telling anyone where I was going. Another officer from the Army Press Service called shortly afterwards to stress their demand for secrecy. I was given very little detail, only told to be at the crossing point between the Gaza Strip and Israel a little later that evening. The decision to go was not a difficult one. I knew that this was a rare opportunity. As it turned out, this was the only time I was offered this kind of access in the whole of my 2 years in Gaza. I also knew that the opportunity to cover even one story from a particular side gives you an insight that can inform your reporting for weeks or even months to come. I'd already been in Gaza for more than 6 months and reported extensively on the effect the conflict had had on the territory and its people. In so doing, I'd also striven to reflect Israel's point of view with a very limited knowledge of how their troops actually operated. So the journalistic reasons for accepting this offer were clear. There was another ethical dimension which I think might have led some reporters to turn the request down. In many of Israel's military raids into Gaza, their troops killed civilians. They almost certainly would tonight. That being so, was I right to accompany them? By being with them as a witness, was I accepting that what they were doing was right? Was I risking compromising journalistic ethics in return for access? I considered these questions at the time, although briefly and not just because time was short. From the point of view of access to information, this was a rare and important chance which I had to take. The best reporting combines experience of as many sides of the story as possible. In Gaza, I spoke to the bereaved and the homeless almost every day. I rarely had the chance to speak to the soldiers who caused the death and destruction. Personal security is usually a further consideration when deciding whether or not to accept an offer to accompany an army. On this occasion, that was less of a concern for two reasons. First, as is usually the case, an army will try to ensure the safety of a reporter, not least because its own reputation might suffer if a civilian under its protection were to come to harm. Second, I knew the Israelis so vastly outgunned the Palestinian fighters that there was little real prospect of my finding myself in harm's way. The column moved off around midnight. I was in an armoured personnel carrier together with a BBC cameraman who was an Israeli colleague and a number of soldiers. The access we got that night was rare, but in other ways not especially illuminating. Our understanding of what was happening was restricted to what we could hear going on outside the shell of the armoured personnel carrier, and to what we could see through the turret above our heads. From my knowledge of the geography of the northern Gaza Strip, I guessed at some point we must have travelled along part of the route that my Palestinian colleague and I had followed as he drove me to the crossing point early that evening. At one stage, the column stopped in the middle of Jabalia, that's a big refugee camp. It came under fire, although the vehicle on which I was travelling was not hit. Some of the troops left to seek out a suspected militant, but said it was too dangerous for us to go with them. At that point, we did have a view of the street through the open door, but it was the middle of the night and the only illumination was dim street lighting and tracer fire. Most of the time our view of what was happening was literally blinkered, limited to the circular hole of the turret above our heads. So while the access afforded by the opportunity to travel with the troops was rare, it was also restricted. For a journalist involved in documenting the Israeli-Palestinian conflict over an extended period, it was invaluable. I was able to put a face to some of the troops who so frequently carried out military operations in the area in which I lived and for which I reported. I gained an insight, however brief, into the way they carried out those operations. And if there's one thing I remember from that night, at one point, one of the vehicles in the convoy, in the column, broke down. And normally, with the result that all of them had to come to a halt. Now, normally this is a point at which soldiers become very nervous because one tactic for stopping a column of troops is to destroy the first vehicle and destroy the last vehicle, so everyone's in the middle of court there. But it was very interesting that night because when this broke down and we sat there while they fixed the vehicle that had caused the hold-up, the Israeli soldiers weren't nervous, they were bored. And I can only be reminded of seeing the faces of passengers. They must have been quite tense, they were going into battle, but the reason why it was illuminating particularly to me was they seemed to be fed up rather. I was slightly reminded of people sitting on a train that had broken down. And it gave me a real insight into how they saw the people they were fighting. Because, of course, had they been fighting an enemy who had artillery or helicopters or anything like that, they would have been in great danger to stop. But they weren't, and so they seemed much more relaxed. And it gave me a real insight into the way they carried out their operations. Now, I think if I can actually, to illustrate that, a couple of points that I want to make. I've got that report here. If I can just what I've done here, so I just said we want to go to sleep. So that's still there, okay. Do I need to select something else from there? What if I just... It is on this. I played the beginning of it before.
Technical, not there. You have to do it from there. Can you see?
Yeah, there you go. It's a rather long time ago, so you might recognise me. I don't look exactly the same.
Early morning in Gaza. Firefighters struggle to contain the damage of the night before. Then the explosion which sent the death toll in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict even higher. Caused by an Israeli shell, say the Palestinians, by a bomb intended for an Israeli tank, say the Israelis. More than 100 people were injured. Medical staff struggled to cope with the casualties. Before the operation, we got a rare invitation to go with the Israeli army. No lights allowed in the battle zone, so we used our special night vision camera. The Israeli troops set off to search for Palestinian militants among the tens of thousands of people living in the shanty towns on the edge of Gaza City. We're now in the middle of the Jabalia refugee camp. Some of the troops that came in this armoured personnel carrier have moved out to take over a house. They wanted us to come too, but now they've told us to stay in the armoured personnel carrier because we're coming under fire. Shooting rocked the streets. The Israeli army say they're determined to crush armed Palestinian groups. The Palestinians are determined to fight back. This morning, on the other side of the conflict, young Israelis remember the victims of yesterday's bomb in Haifa. Many of the dead were teenagers. Palestinians accuse the Israelis of carrying out the Gaza raid in retaliation. The Israelis deny this, but that will make little difference to a population distraught and defiant after more Palestinian deaths. James Rodgers, BBC News, Gaza.
No, you can do it.
Sorry, monitors used to have been like that.
No, the monitor's just gone, unfortunately. I've got that. So I want to leave plenty of time for questions. I'm aware we've only got about 20 minutes left, so I'll just briefly make another couple of points. As I say, I went a couple of times to Iraq, particularly in late 2003, and was there when Saddam Hussein was caught, which was a very interesting experience, principally because of the way in which the news was managed. There were, and so I'll just sort of go through this section quite quickly so that we can have a chance to have a discussion at the end. It was a Saturday night, and where everything was sort of relatively quiet in the city, but on that Sunday morning, the next morning, rumours began circulating that Saddam Hussein had been captured. You know, I was there just on a sort of short assignment, so I asked my colleagues who had been there longer term if this was something which happened very frequently. And they said yes, there are quite often rumours that he's been captured, but never with this sort of intensity. Then that afternoon, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Baghdad time, and I'll tell you why I mentioned the time in a moment, the American occupying coalition called a news conference and invited everyone to their headquarters. And by that stage, the rumours were getting stronger and stronger that they were going to announce the capture of Saddam Hussein. I remember on the way in, soldiers searching everybody who went in. The security was very tight, as you can imagine, but the soldiers saying, has Saddam Hussein been captured? Does this mean that we can go home early? We didn't know. The answer to those questions were I don't know and probably not, I think, with hindsight. But anyway, we went in. And the reason why I mentioned the time was this. Consider the time, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, midday in London, 7 o'clock on the east coast of the United States. And just about early enough to catch the other side of the world as well, the Far East, before it went to bed. So the announcement was duly made at a news conference there that Saddam Hussein had been captured, with the head of the American occupying authority, the Coalition Provisional Authority, coming out and saying, ladies and gentlemen, we got him. At which point many of the Iraqi journalists in the audience burst into cheers. Those people have been opponents of the regime. There's a quick bit of an abandonment of objectivity and impartiality at that point, but I think if you've been locked up by Saddam Hussein you might understand why that would be. But it was so perfectly, and the reason why I consider that, ladies and gentlemen, we got him, perfect. Just a few seconds, perfect for a headline sequence on TV or radio, fits perfectly in a headline. Now, it turned out they had got him the night before, some 19 hours earlier, about 8 o'clock the night before. So it seemed that the whole thing had been very, very carefully stage managed in the meantime. They had decided how this was going to be presented, they decided when it was going to be presented, as I say, to catch all those time zones. Even if it was a Sunday, they were still making sure they were going to make sure of that. And again, it was his hiding, and the next day I actually managed to get to his hiding place. He was hiding this was a sort of, almost like a chimney that went down into an underground hiding place, and whenever American troops had been nearby, they covered this over with planks, and then they put, so it was the corner of a farmyard, and they'd sort of put branches of mud and stuff on top so that you couldn't tell the hole was there. And the Americans have been looking for him in this area for quite some time, because the local villagers to whom I was able to speak, to the translator, were saying, you know, if we'd known he was here, we'd have fought for him. You know, we were very proud of him. And there was a very pro-Saddam Hussein part of the country. He was almost certainly betrayed, obviously, because otherwise he probably wouldn't have been caught. So I suspect somewhere in the United States there are two gentlemen or more of Iraqi descent, now called perhaps John and James Hussein, who were distant relatives of Saddam Hussein and betrayed him, I would imagine, for a very large sum of money. Perhaps we'll find the true story about that one day. But just to conclude, really, that was his hiding place then. It was a massive story on the day, as you could imagine, but the longer term consequences, to come back to that point I made at the beginning, were much harder to predict. because it was only about 6 months after this that the insurgency against the occupation of Iraq began in earnest. And it became clear to policymakers and afterwards that Saddam Hussein was not a key figure in that. His capture was of huge symbolic importance because the invasion had happened in March and he wasn't captured until December, but it didn't really make much difference. And that's one of the big challenges for reporting on something like this. What does this actually mean? Yes, of course, on the day it was a massive story, but immediately you have to try to get onto the stories. What are the consequences of this going to be? We have to tell our audiences what the options could be for what happened. So I just want to conclude now that with 2 more slides. This is one taken in Gaza in early 2004. It's the aftermath of a car bomb. An Israeli helicopter had fired on this car in which 2 fighters from Hamas were travelling. And the reason I've chosen this photograph is because I think it says something about, I mentioned the influences of politics and technology. The technology which we have now gives us the opportunity to reflect all the views of pretty much everyone in the picture there. We can see the gentleman there is sort of looking off into the middle distance. He's a member of the security forces, you can tell from his camouflage. This man here is also a member of the security forces. He's got some sort of surgical gloves on. He's a medic there. The gentleman there is in the brown jacket. He was my colleague. He worked for the BBC Arabic service. I shared an office with him for 2 years. Fayed Abu Shamal, a very fine journalist. And he's got his phone here and he's thinking about what he's going to file. So what I'm saying is that I think particularly the potentials of social media, and we can discuss about how that's changed journalism, it gives us an opportunity to gather and to reflect all these points of view, because we can see that something big has happened, and we can see that any incident like this is going to have all those multiple varying points of view. So just to finish, I'd like to offer you some thoughts on reporting international news and some of the sort of key points which I think they are. Access is absolutely key. I mentioned that was one of the reasons why I decided to take that facility that was offered to me by the Israeli army. Context, history, language and culture. When you're reporting any armed conflict, you will find, I think in almost all parts of the world, you will find history has a bearing on day-to-day life, and people will talk about it in vox pops in a way that we don't so much in Western Europe, with a possible exception. Of course there are exceptions. Ireland would be one major exception, for example. But if your contributors, if the people to whom you are speaking are living with what they see as the consequences of historical decisions, you need to know what they are. So you would never try to, it does happen, of course, you're thrown into the deep end of some things, but even if you're writing about something, if you're going there, try to learn as much as you can about what's happened there in the past, whether the causes of what's happening now lie in history. Language. You're not going to be fluent in every single language, but it's so important, it makes such a difference. If you can learn even a few words of people's language, it shows a respect for them, it shows a respect for their culture, and they're going to be much more likely to help you. Culture as well. Don't behave in a way that's likely to cause offence. Think about what might cause offence. Gaza, as you can imagine, is a very conservative Muslim society. I had to be very careful during the month of Ramadan not to drink a bottle of water in the street, for example. That would have been totally disrespectful to my hosts, 95% of whom were Muslims and all of whom were fasting during Ramadan. So think about this. These are things you can get yourself into real trouble by not respecting the local culture. And then finally, as I sort of said throughout, understand the effects of changing technology. Not just the constraints it's going to place upon you, but also the great possibilities it offers you too. So that was all that I wanted to say really, and then I'm happy to take your questions and a bit more about reading some of my books. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Questions?
Yes.
So I just wanted to go back to the story where you were embedded with the Israeli troops in Gaza, and that was 2003, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
So the concept of embedded journalism was relatively new, wasn't it, at that point?
It was, and I think with hindsight, it was almost at its height. I think in some ways, So, I mean, it did continue after that, but I think I might argue that we're in a post-embedded world now. Anyway, sorry.
So actually a post-embedded world. So now, especially with the rise of social media, you have soldiers performing for perhaps their own cameras in terms of GoPros, and everyone's very tech savvy at that. also performing for reporters' cameras, I believe. And so perhaps you could comment how that dynamic has changed of actually being together with troops and reporting on the news.
That's a good. I mean, I think with all these things, it hasn't, and it hasn't. I mean, if you go back, I mean, one of the I teach a module on the history of journalism. If you go back, into the 19th century, when war reporting, as we would recognise it now, probably started in the middle of the 19th century. There are people then who are sort of keen to show off, and people who don't want to have anything to do with journalists. And you see these types still now. But obviously, one thing which has changed is the way that you don't need to be a professional to create the content. But of course, armies are very careful about what they'll allow people to post and what they won't. In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I mean, it was back in 2009, I think, there was, and there's a lot, obviously, during the war in Gaza last year, of exchanges going on social media. But in 2009, there was a sort of warning given both by the Israeli army to its soldiers and by Hamas to its fighters not to go on social media because they're giving too much away. Now, this is 5 or 6 years ago, so I think people are a bit more savvy now, but all of these things are a bit of a double-edged sword, really. Does that answer your question?
Perhaps I shouldn't go too much into it, because
That's all right.
I'm guessing there's other questions around.
Okay. Yes, gentleman there, yes, please.
What kind of international customs did you find yourself having to adjust to? For instance, did you ever change, say, your dress, the way you were dressed up, or were there any kind of rules that you found yourself having to change the way you lived to kind of follow?
Well, I mean, the example I gave of sort of making sure you respect Ramadan when you're in a particular, I mean, but it's different. See, I mean, I remember about the same time I went to Jordan, and I was getting on a taxi, and it was a very hot day, and the taxi driver said to me, would you like, we'll stop at the shop and you can get something to drink? And I said, no thanks, it's Ramadan, I wouldn't. And he said, well, you're not a Muslim, it's not Ramadan for you. So, but that wouldn't have been acceptable in Gaza. So I think the general point I make is sort of feel your way. But generally, yes, I mean, you do need to just be, there are certain, just ways that you behave yourself. But until you understand exactly what those are, proceed with caution and be as polite as you can. And as I said, this is where learning even the simplest greeting or the simplest introduction in a language can be a real icebreaker. And obviously, I remember there were many parts in Gaza, particularly when you were near funerals, you quite often were, as a journalist, then female colleagues would have to cover their heads. I went to the Holocaust War Memorial in Jerusalem, outside Jerusalem, and being perhaps more used to Western Christian traditions, I was taking off the hat that I was wearing, but of course in Jewish tradition it's appropriate for men to have their heads covered when they go into somewhere sacred. So the guard at the door said, put your hat back on before you go in. So I think that's just a sort of quite small example, but I think it illustrates that you need to think about all these things wherever you go. Yes?
So when you first got into the Gaza Strip, being the only international journalist there, did you find it difficult to make contacts in the beginning?
Not really. I mean, I was very fortunate. I think because I worked with the colleague from the BBC Arabic service, so I think we sort of were able to complement our sets of contacts, really. I had access to Western diplomats into the Israeli army, which he didn't have. A Palestinian journalist could hardly phone up the Israeli army press office, whoever they were working for. And he had very good contacts with Palestinian politics and medical sources and things like that. I mean, but I'll make no pretense about it. I was extremely grateful to him, and he was very useful. But after a while, being the only journalist in a place like that, you get to be a bit of a novelty, and a lot of Palestinians learned English, so a lot of people wanted to speak to me to practice their English and things like that. Yes.
You mentioned about September the 11th and the dilemma you had with ethics about families that were looking for their loved ones. What did you do? What was your response?
I used it. I used it in a measured way. I think if somebody had gone on for 2 or 3 minutes saying how they were quite certain they were going to find somebody, then firstly there wouldn't have been time to use all of that. But I think So I decided to use it. So it was a way of telling the story of how. I mean, I think the audiences aren't stupid. The audience, like me, were probably thinking, well, unfortunately, I don't think you will find the person you're looking for.
But they probably also thought if it was my loved one, I'd be...
Well, exactly. That's why they understood that, and I think that was a very good way of telling the story. Of thinking, this was right in the centre of one of the most developed cities in the world. This not in an earthquake zone or not in a war zone, so they thought, and then suddenly this has happened. So I think it did help. I mean, one of the big challenges, of course, in any kind of reporting is to create that sense of place and that sense of time, and I think that really helped too. So, but I did think about it. If I just, I mean, it wouldn't have been appropriate, I don't think, to sort of cut together 5 or 6 of the people just saying, I'm sure I'm going to find them. I think that would have been an example of using that kind of material inappropriately. Yes.
I just wanted to ask about sort of the emotional side of things. When you've seen everything that you've seen during the day, and then you come back to your bedroom at night, and how do you process that? So that's the first part, and then the second part is this impartiality that you're meant to have as a reporter. Did you find yourself pulled in a certain direction because of some of the emotion that you'd felt, that you perhaps want to report at a different angle to follow through? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of people who cover conflict do suffer from post-traumatic stress. I mean, I know a number of people personally who have. And I think, obviously, I didn't tend to process things there, and I think everybody's different. I mean, the example that's often given, if were there a small quantity of an infectious disease in this room, not all of us would get it. And I think, in some way, I mean, I'm no sort of psychologist or medical expert, but I think in some ways the same is true. You see people who are exposed to the same experience and they respond in very different ways. Some people, it's surprising, and you sometimes think when you hear about this that it can't possibly be true, but I do know certainly of at least one example where it affected people many, many years afterwards, and quite suddenly. But I suppose I'd sort of think these things through afterwards, really, to a large extent. I do remember once, I had a very, I was once very nearly killed in an air raid. When I say very nearly, 2 of the people to whom I'd been speaking were killed, and I just happened to run for cover in the right direction. And I sort of got through that and I was fine. I was very physically tired afterwards, and I think. And then about 6 months later, when I was on holiday somewhere perfectly safe, I was on holiday in Scotland, I had nightmares about it 3 nights in a row. And that was 20 years ago, and it's never ever bothered me since. So my sort of amateur self-diagnosis, I assume that was my system saying 6 months later, okay, now you can deal with that, it's safe to deal with that. And that was sort of like it leaving my system. I don't know, but as I say, it's never troubled me since. I haven't forgotten it though, obviously. As far as impartiality goes, I mean, there's a few things to be said about that. Firstly, I think when you are in very difficult circumstances and you're taking very difficult editorial decisions under pressure, extreme time pressure, and sometimes in physical danger, it's really good to have that sort of professional ethos to hold on to. It's when you've got nobody to advise you, nobody to look after you, it's quite good to have that to hold on to sort of guide you through it. And I personally believe, I mean, and I know this is possibly a way in which journalistic fashions are changing perhaps. We see more and more of a kickback against the impartiality and objectivity which has dominated particularly English language journalism for the last century, but not forever, by the way. If you look at the 19th century, it's not like that. So it's much more of a sort of new phenomenon to do with having to sell news to radio audience as well as there are commercial pressures. But I personally believe in it because I think you see some Western reporters who go to war zones from outside and they become so emotionally involved that I think that undermines credibility by reporting. Although some people will profoundly disagree with me, that's my personal conclusion on it. Yes, the gentleman.
Yes, as you said, being in a conflict zone will always indicate that there are 2 or more interests of the 2 conflicting parties that are very careful what is reported. So have you ever been stopped from reporting something? I mean, proactively someone coming to you and saying you're not going to report this?
Yeah, I mean, I think you do find that in war zones sometimes. I mean, I think there's the people who don't want to be filmed doing things occasionally. And it's happened to me in Russia, and it happened to me it happens to you quite a lot in conflict zones. People will try to stop you. Sometimes you can negotiate your way around, and sometimes you can't. And sometimes, and then quite often, if you can't, then you just say, we weren't allowed to go here, or it was too dangerous to go here. You try to be as open with your audience as you can. And I think this is one thing where new technology has really helped, because at one time, of course, you had no outlet for that sort of thing, unless you were going to make a sort of documentary film about the coverage of something. Whereas now, of course, you can easily, all news organisations, even I'm sure most people in this room have even got a WordPress blog or something, you could go on there and write 500 words and explain what the circumstances were in which you've got this for members of the audience which are interested in that. And even the BBC, if you think, has got the editors column on their website, and lots of other big news organisations have to explain that. But yes, it does happen. That's why, when I said on the slide before, I think that's why access is one of the most important things. And I don't just mean physical access, although I do mean physical access, but also in terms of access to information and understanding the language and what's going on around you too. Yes.
What specifically motivated you towards reporting on conflict? Because you said, as I think most people get into journalism to report on issues and maybe raise awareness for things and change what's bad about the world, but you can do that in other spheres.
Yeah.
I was just wondering what motivated you towards potentially very dangerous and difficult.
I felt I had to. I mean, you do meet people. There's some people who report on conflict who are ex-military and actually are really interested in that. I could tell you very little about different weapons, for example. It's not my expertise, such as it is live. But I felt, and to go back to the point I made at the very beginning about the end of the Soviet Union and the post-Cold War world, I wanted to cover international affairs. And I felt that in the world that I've seen, to do that, you had to cover that. And I never sort of put my hand up to do that, but it was just the way that it turned out. Because, and I think this is where journalism adds a real value, because you get peace conferences, you get diplomats talking in rooms, you get prime ministers around conference tables, and most of them have never been there and they've got no idea what they're talking about. Yes, they have in terms of geopolitics, but they haven't in terms of what the people are actually going through. Tony Blair famously observed he couldn't believe how bad the situation was in the West Bank when he finally went there, after years of making policy about it. So that was why, but the first conflict I covered was in Georgia, the former Soviet Republic of Georgia in 1992 after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And it was part of the instability which followed that. But I strongly felt, I was assigned to go there, but I strongly felt in order really to understand the situation as a journalist you had to. And I never sort of definitely sought out postings which would lead me into armed conflict, but that, it was to further my understanding of the world and to tell the stories of people that was why. But I think you'll find very few journalists of my generation who would describe themselves as a war correspondent. That's something quite specific. And in the Second World War, it was actually how journalists who accompanied the troops were defined. They would wear uniforms with war correspondent and shoulder flash. I've never worn uniform, and I would feel quite uncomfortable about doing it. That would be another discussion to have. Had the Israelis insisted I wore their uniform that night, I might not have gone, actually. So does that answer your question? So it was more, I think it's, because I did definitely want to cover international news, and just in the world, in which I worked as a journalist, that was an integral part of it.
And you led to thinking to do that properly, you had to be there.
Yeah, you get asked to do. Those are the stories that, if it bleeds, it leads, as the old saying goes. So those are often the things that you were assigned to. But I could never feel, really, that I could go and report on peace talks if I hadn't got some idea, maybe not of that particular conflict, but something about what war was about.
Do we have one more question?
Sorry,
again. In terms of technology, what do you think about the new ways of communicating and telling news, the different platforms? Because, for example, I heard that Snapchat, for example, is going to be the journalism of the future. So, what do you think about that?
Well, I think there's two sort of big points to make. One, I think the changing technology has offered a lot of new opportunities, like, for example, the way that the example I gave of being able to write about stuff. Because on the internet there's unlimited space. That was one thing I really noticed in my time as a journalist. Stuff that you had to throw away because you only got a minute 30 to tell the story, you can now use in a way that you couldn't 15 or 20 years ago. But the other thing, and I think this is true of politics too, is that nothing lasts forever. So maybe Snapchat's going to be the future of news, but it may only be the future of news for the next 2 to 3 years, or 5 years, or however long it is. There's a great story to illustrate this, which is when Google were talking to the British Library about digitising their content, which you know has got pretty much every book that was ever published in this country. And the head of the British Library, I don't know if it's true, and I can't remember where I read it, but I think even if it's not true, it illustrates very nicely this point. The British Library representative said to the Google executives, what are we going to do when Google isn't there anymore? And Google, despite the fact that Google has made its whole success out of getting rid of stuff that isn't there anymore, they've never thought the same thing might happen to them. And I think if we can draw any conclusions of the way technology has changed journalism over the last 20 years or so, nothing is going to last forever. So yes, one other app or site can make a big influence, but something else is almost certainly going to come along, I think.
So is there any more questions? Was there one more question at the back there? No? That's it. Okay, well thank you very much, James. We're out of time.